Everyone said I was lucky. They said my son took me in, that his wife handled everything, that I didn't have to worry about a thing anymore. That was the version they smiled at. What they never noticed was how carefully I stopped touching my own life. I am Margaret Lewis, and by the time people began calling me a burden, they had already been living off the parts of me I could no longer defend. When you grow old quietly, people assume you are empty. That assumption is very convenient for them. I used to believe that being needed was the same as being loved. It took me longer than I cared to admit to learn the difference. Before I moved into Daniel's house, my life was simple and mine. I lived in the same small apartment for almost 30 years, the kind of place where the walls remember you even when the paint fades and the hallway light flickers on its own schedule. I had routines that belonged to me. Coffee at 6, medication at 7, the radio low so the neighbors wouldn't complain. A short walk if my knees felt cooperative, and a longer rest if they didn't. My pension wasn't large, but it arrived on time every month, and steadiness matters more than size when you're old enough to understand bills. I paid everything myself. I balanced my own checkbook. I never owed anyone an explanation. Daniel worried, or at least he said he did. He called one night and told me it didn't make sense for me to be alone anymore, not after the fall last winter, not with prices going up, not when he had space. He said Melissa agreed. He said it twice, like repetition turned agreement into proof. I remember holding the phone and looking at the calendar on my wall, the one I'd been marking since Daniel was a boy, birthdays circled, school holidays underlined. I didn't want to be a problem. I had spent my whole life making sure I wasn't, so I said yes. From the outside, Melissa looked like the answer people like me are told to pray for. She smiled easily, the kind of smile that settled rooms. She spoke softly, always calm. Always reasonable. She said things like, "We'll take care of you now, and you shouldn't have to think about that stuff anymore." Neighbors loved her. At church, women leaned toward her and told her she was doing such a beautiful thing. She laughed it off every time, like kindness just followed her around without effort. Daniel stood beside her, relieved in that distracted way men get when someone else promises to manage the details. The first week I moved in, Melissa insisted on organizing everything. She said it wasn't control, it was efficiency. She set up folders for paperwork, color-coded and labeled neatly. Medical. Insurance. Banking. She said it made sense to keep things in one place, so nothing got lost. I didn't ask which place she meant. She told me I'd earned the right not to worry anymore. People say things like that as if worry is a switch you can flip off. I let her forward my mail at first, just the official things. I let her sit beside me while I logged into accounts I'd been managing for years, explaining features I'd never asked about. She said it would be easier if everything was accessible when needed. I nodded, because nodding keeps the peace and I was still trying to be grateful. Later, she suggested downloading the banking app on her phone too, just in case something urgent came up. It sounded reasonable when she said it. Most things do right before they stop being yours. The house itself was bright and orderly, but it had a quiet hierarchy you could feel if you paid attention. Daniel and Melissa had the master bedroom, the office, the living room that stayed untouched unless company came over. I had a smaller room at the end of the hall. Melissa called it cozy. Close enough to be checked on, far enough to be overlooked. I told myself it didn't matter. I have lived in smaller spaces before. Meals were shared, technically. Dinner happened at the table most nights. But portions were decided before the plates reached me. Seconds were for the kids. Dessert was a lot of sugar for you anyway. If I hesitated, Melissa would smile and say she was just looking out for my health. Later, when my stomach tightened in that quiet way hunger does, I told myself discipline was good. Old women aren't supposed to need much. That's what people believe, even when they don't say it out loud. My medication schedule changed without anyone announcing it. Pills appeared in one of those plastic boxes with the days of the week stamped on the lids. Melissa filled it every Sunday, efficient and careful. Sometimes a slot was empty and she'd say the pharmacy was running behind. Sometimes a dose looked different and she'd say the doctor had mentioned adjusting it once. She never sounded unsure. One afternoon I felt lightheaded enough to sit down hard on the edge of the bed. Daniel glanced up from his laptop and said, "Melissa's got it handled, Mom. You're fine." He meant it as comfort. That's what made it hurt. The children learned quickly. Emma wrinkled her nose once and said, "Mom says Grandma doesn't need all that. when I reached for an extra blanket. Jake told me medicine was expensive and I should be careful. He was 9. That kind of sentence doesn't come from nowhere. In public, I was treated like a fragile heirloom. Melissa told people she managed my finances because I got confused sometimes. She said it gently, with concern, and everyone nodded like that settled the matter. At family gatherings, she poured my tea and reminded me to sit. Someone once said I was blessed. I smiled back because correcting them would have required explaining things they weren't ready to hear. Privately, my world narrowed. Bank statements stopped arriving. When I asked, Melissa said paper mail wasn't safe anymore. When I asked again, she said I worried too much. My pension was combined for household efficiency. That was her phrase. It sounded official enough to end the conversation. I didn't know how much of it was left for me, only that there never seemed to be quite enough when I needed something small. I started noticing patterns then. Groceries arrived regularly, but my specific foods didn't. Prescriptions were picked up later and later. Insurance emails went to Melissa's account. None of it was dramatic. That was the problem. Exploitation that looks practical is hard to name. I told myself families adjust. I told myself Daniel is busy. I told myself silence was the price of peace. I had raised my son once without complaint, stretching money and swallowing fear so he wouldn't have to carry it. I thought I could do this too. But at night, lying awake in that narrow bed, listening to the house settle around me, I felt something heavy and clear take shape in my chest. It wasn't age. It wasn't illness. It was the understanding that I was no longer seen as someone who contributed, only as a cost to be managed. They used my pension without asking. They rationed my medicine without explaining. And when I hesitated, when I took up space a second longer than expected, I could feel the word forming behind polite smiles. Burden. I didn't notice the shift at first because nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices. No slammed doors. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of change that slips in while everyone is busy pretending things are normal. One day I was part of the house, and the next I was simply placed inside it. Melissa never announced anything. She didn't have to. She just began moving through decisions as if my consent had already been filed away somewhere unnecessary. My sweaters stopped hanging in the hall closet. They appeared folded in neat stacks in my bedroom, like a polite reminder of where I was expected to remain. The armchair by the window, the one Daniel bought me years ago because I liked the afternoon light, was suddenly in the way when guests came over. It was relocated to the corner of my room without a conversation. Melissa said it made more sense there. She always framed things as sense. For a moment, I even wondered if this was just age talking, if I was reacting to shadows instead of substance. That thought passed quietly, but it lingered longer than it should have. People imagine mistreatment looks like cruelty. They're wrong. It usually looks like efficiency. Melissa ran the house like a system, not a home. Systems don't ask feelings for permission. They just optimize. My days were streamlined into something smaller. Meals were lighter. Not intentionally, she'd say. Just practical. We're trying to eat cleaner, she mentioned once, sliding a modest plate toward me while the rest of the table helped themselves freely. Light became another word that didn't include me. When my hands shook slightly reaching for water, she frowned like it was an inconvenience, not concern. You should slow down, she said gently, as if the problem were my timing. Daniel stayed busy. That was his shield. Long hours. Late meetings. Always tired. When I tried to explain that certain things felt different now, he smiled in that distracted way parents do when children ramble. Mom, you're overthinking it, he said once, squeezing my shoulder. Melissa's got everything handled. He meant it as reassurance. It landed like dismissal. I told myself marriage changes people, that sons grow outward, not backward. Loving him meant letting him believe things were fine, even when my body suggested otherwise. The practical matters slid into place without announcements. Melissa said it was easier if everything stayed in one place. I didn't ask which place she meant. Bills were handled now. Forms appeared already signed. When my pension deposit arrived later than usual, she laughed it off. Banks mess this stuff up all the time, she said, waving her phone like proof. It's such a headache. I thanked her for dealing with it. Gratitude became my default language because questioning her tone felt like questioning her character, and no one wanted to do that. My prescriptions stretched longer than they should have. When I mentioned feeling lightheaded, She said the pharmacy was backed up again, that insurance always caused delays. The doctor mentioned adjusting it once. She added casually, like it was settled. Daniel nodded, already halfway back to his screen. Between smaller meals and postponed refills, my body felt thinner in ways mirrors don't measure. Cold settled into my bones even when the house was warm. What unsettled me most wasn't Melissa. It was how quickly the children adapted. Emma stopped saying please. Jake stopped looking up when I spoke. Once, when I moved too slowly getting out of their way, Emma sighed and said, "Mom says you should plan better." The sentence didn't sound like hers. Children don't invent that tone. They borrow it. They practice it. That was when I stopped dismissing patterns as coincidence. I became quieter, but not smaller. I noticed Melissa corrected me in front of others more often now, always smiling, always gentle. She forgets sometimes, she'd say, squeezing my hand as if to anchor me. People nodded sympathetically. I remembered everything. That was the problem. I noticed receipts carefully saved while conversations conveniently weren't. I noticed how often my name was used to justify decisions I hadn't agreed to. One afternoon, our neighbor Carol stopped by with a pie. She was the kind of woman who asked real questions and waited for real answers. While Melissa stepped into the kitchen, Carol leaned closer and said quietly, "You doing okay in here?" It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't invasive. It was casual. That's what made my chest tighten. I almost said yes out of habit. Instead, I paused. Carol didn't rush me. She just looked at me, really looked, like she was listening even before I spoke. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Not because I was scared, but because something finally settled into place. I understood then that my silence wasn't protecting my son. It was protecting the structure Melissa had built around him. My endurance had become her proof that everything worked. I didn't feel angry. Anger is loud. This was quieter. This was clarity. So I stopped explaining myself. I stopped correcting small inaccuracies. I stopped offering reminders. Instead, I began keeping track. Dates. Phrases. Missed pills. Adjusted numbers. I wrote them down in an old paperback no one ever opened. I watched how Melissa grew more confident when she thought I was fading. I watched how Daniel stayed absent without meaning to be cruel. I waited. Not because I was weak, but because timing matters. Silence, I learned, isn't surrender when you're the one choosing it. People assume silence means nothing is happening. What they don't understand is that silence can be busy. Once I stopped reacting, the house adjusted to my stillness in ways that revealed more than noise ever could. Melissa mistook my quiet for surrender. That was her first mistake. She moved more freely after that, less careful with her words, more confident in her assumptions. Systems always loosen when they think they've won. I stopped reminding anyone of anything. No more gentle corrections. No more soft explanations. When meals came smaller, I ate them without comment. When my medication ran low, I waited an extra day before mentioning it. When bills were discussed around me as if I weren't there, I kept my eyes on my tea. I wasn't testing them. I was watching patterns finish forming. Daniel noticed I spoke less. He asked once if I was feeling tired. I said I was fine. It was the truth, just not the whole one. He nodded, relieved. People accept answers that let them move on. That's human nature. Melissa, on the other hand, began narrating my life on my behalf. She doesn't like too much noise anymore, she told guests. She gets confused with paperwork. Each sentence was delivered with concern, not cruelty. That's what made it effective. Public kindness has a way of hiding private authority. The children followed her lead with quiet precision. Emma stopped asking me questions altogether. Jake began answering for me when others addressed me directly. It wasn't disrespect in their minds. It was adaptation. I remembered then how easily behavior travels through a house, how tone becomes instruction without ever being taught. I wondered how long it would take before my absence felt normal to them, even while I was still sitting right there. One afternoon, Melissa reorganized the kitchen while I was in the living room. She didn't ask. She narrated. "This makes more sense," she said, shifting things higher, farther, out of reach. When I mentioned I couldn't find my mug later, she smiled like it was charming. "Oh, I thought you didn't use that anymore." For a brief second, doubt flickered through me. Had I stopped using it? Or had someone decided I should? The question lingered longer than the answer. That night, I opened the paperback where I'd been writing things down. Dates were filling pages now. Not accusations. Observations. Times. Amounts. Phrases. The way Melissa's voice changed when Daniel entered the room. The way it flattened when he left. The way my name was used as explanation for choices already made. I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. Carol knocked again a week later. This time, she stayed longer. She talked about her sister, about how quickly independence disappears when others decide they're helping. She never mentioned me directly. She didn't have to. When she left, she squeezed my hand and said, "If you ever need a ride or a place to sit for a while, just holler." It was said lightly, but it landed heavy. Outsiders have a way of naming exits without forcing you to take them. After that, I began making small choices that belonged only to me. I scheduled my own doctor appointment and didn't mention it until it was already done. I picked up my prescriptions myself once Daniel was at work. I noticed how surprised Melissa looked when I returned with the bag. Not angry, just unsettled. Control doesn't like unscheduled variables. She adjusted quickly. She always did. "You should have told me," she said, smiling too tightly. "I worry." I nodded and thanked her. Gratitude kept her balanced. Resistance would have sharpened her. I wasn't ready for sharp. Money conversations shifted subtly after that. She began explaining more than before, justifying things that hadn't been questioned. Numbers came with stories now. I listened. I noticed which stories repeated and which changed. I noticed when Daniel stopped listening altogether. Absence isn't always physical. Sometimes it's just disengagement dressed as trust. One evening, as the family sat together, Melissa mentioned moving some funds to simplify things. Daniel agreed without looking up. Emma asked if it meant a new vacation. Melissa laughed. Everyone smiled. I said nothing, but something inside me clicked then, quiet and final. I understood that waiting wasn't passive anymore. It was preparation. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel afraid. I felt precise. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop hoping someone will see you and start accepting that they won't unless they're made to look. That night, I added one more note to my book. Not a date. Not a detail. Just a sentence. This is no longer about surviving the house. It's about stepping out of the role they assigned me. I slept better after that. Not because things had improved, but because I finally knew where I stood. And when you know your position, you can decide your next move without asking permission. By the time people start noticing something is off, it's usually because the balance they relied on has shifted. I didn't announce my shift. I didn't warn anyone. I simply stopped cushioning the house from the consequences of its own decisions. For years, I had absorbed small frictions before they became visible, questions redirected, schedules smoothed, mistakes quietly corrected. When that stopped, the house didn't collapse. It just began to sound different. Melissa continued managing everything as if nothing had changed, but the rhythm was off now. She rushed where she used to glide. She checked lists twice, then a third time. She corrected herself mid-sentence, sometimes laughing too quickly afterward, as if speed alone could erase hesitation. Confidence does that when it starts answering questions it wasn't asked. Daniel grew busier. Or maybe he had always been busy, and I was only now seeing how convenient that busyness had become. His meetings ran late. His phone stayed face down on the table. He trusted Melissa with the details because details bored him. He trusted me to be fine because I always had been. Trust, I learned, is often just a habit that hasn't been challenged yet. The first slip was small. A bill paid twice. Melissa waved it off, blaming the system. "These apps glitch all the time," she said, shaking her head like someone tired of explaining technology to people who didn't understand it. I nodded, the way people do when they don't want to interrupt. The second slip came a week later, when the pharmacy called asking why my refill hadn't been picked up. Melissa said she'd already handled it. The pharmacist sounded confused. Confusion leaves traces, even when people try to smooth it over. I began receiving mail again. Not because anyone returned it to me, but because Melissa missed a day. One envelope mentioned a statement I hadn't seen in months. Another included a courtesy notice, polite but firm. The language was careful, professional, the kind used when an organization wants to document concern without accusing anyone of anything yet. I didn't show them to anyone. I placed them in my drawer, right next to the notebook. Patterns look different when you lay them side by side. Carol noticed the change before the family did. She asked if things were okay because, as she put it, You've got that look people get when they're already done explaining. I smiled, not because I was hiding something, but because she was right. We sat quietly for a while. Silence with the right person doesn't feel like disappearance. It feels like rest. At a family gathering that month, Melissa played her role perfectly. Compliments flowed easily. She refilled glasses before anyone asked, laughed at the right moments, told the same story she always told, just a little louder this time. When she touched my shoulder, it was just long enough for others to notice. We'd be lost without her, she said once, squeezing gently. People nodded. The sentence floated around the room like a kindness. I let it. I had learned by then that truth doesn't argue with performance. It waits for fatigue. Later that night, after the guests left and the house settled into its evening quiet, Daniel mentioned that things felt tense lately. He didn't say between whom. Just tense. I told him households go through phases. He agreed, relieved. Relief is a powerful blindfold. It allows people to believe complexity has already been handled by someone else. The children noticed things in their own way. Emma asked why my chair was gone from the living room. Melissa said it was temporary, that it didn't fit the space anymore. Jake asked why I wasn't coming along on errands. She prefers staying home, Melissa replied quickly, before I could answer. Preferences are easy to assign when the person isn't consulted. Children don't argue with explanations, they absorb tone. The next doctor's visit mattered more than Melissa expected. She came along, confident, prepared, a folder tucked neatly under her arm. But the doctor asked questions Melissa couldn't answer without looking at me. Dates. Dosages. Changes. It wasn't suspicion. It was awareness. Sometimes that's all it takes for a professional to adjust the way they listen. On the drive home, Melissa talked more than usual. She explained scheduling, insurance systems. She repeated herself once, then laughed and blamed the long day. Words spill when control loosens. That evening, she reorganized paperwork again, moving faster, less carefully. A receipt slipped from a folder she hadn't meant to open in front of me. She picked it up too quickly, too carefully. I didn't mention it. I didn't need to. Once people start guarding things, they tell you exactly where to look. 2 days later, Daniel received a call. He took it in the kitchen, voice low, back turned. When he returned, he asked me if I'd noticed any issues lately. It was the first time he looked at me like I might know something he didn't. I said no. Not because I was lying, but because the truth had grown larger than a yes or no answer. He nodded slowly, already thinking ahead, already delegating concern instead of holding it. That night, I added another sentence to my notebook. Not angry. Not hopeful. Just certain. When systems are built on silence, they fail loudly the moment silence stops cooperating. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. And for the first time in a long while, steadiness felt like power, not endurance. People think endings arrive with noise. Raised voices. Slammed doors. Someone finally snapping. That's what movies teach us. Real life doesn't work that way. Real life closes quietly, the way a door does when no one is standing on the other side anymore. By the time things reached their end in our house, nothing dramatic was left to say. Everything important had already been written down. The first letter came from the bank. It wasn't accusatory. Banks rarely are. It was polite, measured, and firm in that unmistakable corporate tone that says something has been noticed. It asked for clarification. About discrepancies. About access. About authorization. Melissa read it twice before folding it back into the envelope. She didn't bring it up at dinner. She didn't bring it up the next morning either. Silence has weight when people are used to controlling the narrative. A week later, Daniel asked if I'd changed anything recently. His voice was casual, but his eyes were alert in a way they hadn't been before. I told him I'd started keeping my own records again. That was all. I didn't accuse. I didn't explain. I just said it like someone stating a fact about the weather. He nodded, slow and thoughtful, like a man realizing the ground under him might not be as solid as he assumed. Melissa grew careful after that. Not kinder. Careful. She stopped making decisions in front of me. Stopped finishing my sentences for me when others were around. She smiled more, but the smile didn't land the way it used to. Smiles, when forced, feel like contracts written in invisible ink. They look fine until someone asks to read the fine print. The call from Adult Protective Services surprised Daniel. It didn't surprise me. They didn't accuse anyone. They never do at first. They asked questions. Neutral ones. How finances were handled. Who managed medications. Whether I felt comfortable. Comfort is a funny word. People use it when they don't want to ask about dignity. I answered honestly. Calmly. With dates. With patterns. With receipts. When the woman on the phone paused before her next question, I knew the conversation had shifted. Melissa wasn't home when the follow-up visit was scheduled. That wasn't intentional, she said later. Just bad timing. The social worker was polite, professional, and observant. She noticed things people living inside a system stop seeing. The locked drawer. The outdated medication list. The mail redirected without written consent. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, it told a story that didn't need embellishment. Daniel sat in on that meeting. He didn't interrupt. Didn't defend. He just listened. Sometimes realization doesn't look like anger. Sometimes it looks like stillness. The kind that settles in when someone finally understands that trust was misplaced, not broken. After that, things moved quickly, but quietly. Access was adjusted. Accounts were separated. Recommendations were made, gently but firmly. Melissa protested once. Just once. She said she was only trying to help. That she'd sacrificed so much. That she felt attacked. The words fell flat in a room where documentation had already done the talking. When systems rely on intention, they argue. When they rely on evidence, they conclude. Daniel didn't look at her when decisions were finalized. He looked at me. Not with accusation. Not with pity. With something heavier. Recognition. The kind that comes too late to fix everything, but early enough to prevent further damage. He apologized that night. Not with grand words. Just a quiet, I should have paid more attention. I told him that attention isn't something you owe people after the fact. It's something you practice while things are still easy. The children adjusted faster than anyone. They always do. Emma brought my chair back into the living room without asking. Jake stopped correcting me when I spoke. Respect, I learned, doesn't need to be taught loudly. It just needs to be modeled consistently. Melissa moved out within the month. Not in disgrace. Not in handcuffs. Just with a tight smile and boxes packed too neatly. Consequences don't always arrive wearing punishment. Sometimes they arrive wearing clarity. She lost control first. Then credibility. Everything else followed naturally. The house feels different now. Quieter. Not because fewer people live here, but because nothing is being managed behind closed doors anymore. I handle my own affairs. I keep my own records. I speak when something feels off. Not sharply. Just clearly. People still say I'm lucky. That my son stepped up. That things worked out. I let them believe that if it makes them comfortable. The truth is simpler. I stopped shrinking. I stopped cushioning. I stopped mistaking silence for peace. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my value. And once I did, everything else fell into its proper place.